because we're professionals here.
Damn
Well,
straight.
Zane is, anyway. Zane was here like a half hour ago. I'm the problem. So, hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of the Cult of Copy Show. It is Thursday, July 26, 2014, which means my second-born son, Arthur, is 6 days old now. He was born finally on Friday, so all of that uh, whining I was doing basically that led to me
Nice.
taking last week off was finally resolved. So both mom and baby are home. Everybody's happy and healthy. I'm happy to have that because he was like 17 days late. No, 20 days late. He was due on the 1st, so 19 days late.
Wow, a true procrastinator.
Yeah, and it's just one of those things that's kind of psychologically fatiguing to be getting ready for something that can happen at any moment, but just like kind of isn't happening. So you're like, well, it didn't happen tonight, so what are we gonna do today? I guess we're gonna like walk around and twiddle our thumbs, and everything's still packed. Yep, everything's ready to go. Okay, well, let me know. Anyway, everything's fine. Everybody's happy. We got what we wanted. Baby Arthur's super well, and we can quit talking about that and get to the actual point of the show, which is this is the weekly live recorded chat show about the topics of persuasion, influence, manipulation, psychology, any of that kind of fun mental mind control type of stuff, specifically as applies to marketing, but in a more general sense, we talk about how it applies to life. Also, the Cult of Copy, which is the group this show is created for, is available as a Facebook chat group currently. If you go to the URL below my face here, cultofcopy.com, you can request to join. Currently, that points to the Facebook group, but we're working on a website where you can like join an email list and read blog posts and leave comments on show episodes and things like that. We're not there yet. Like I said, we just had a baby, but we're working on it. So that's the Cult of Copy. I am your host. As you can see, my ridiculous series of titles next to my name, the Reverend Dr. Sir Colin D. Terrio. I'm the founder and chief admin of the Cult of Copy, and also the host of this show. And like we said, this show is recorded weekly, new episodes Thursdays at 2 p.m. Eastern, right here on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/cultofcopy. Soon to be, I know I keep promising that, 11 episodes, and now soon to be an iTunes and Stitcher podcast in an audio-only version for those of you that like that sort of thing. That's part of the reason why we're building the new Cult of Copy website, to help link all of this crazy stuff we're doing all together. The last component of the show, as you may know if you jumped on time and were here before I was, our director is Zane Miller of G-Tron Marketing. I'm going to give him a second to tell you how you can get in touch with him and learn about what he does, primarily teaching me how to do things like I'm doing with this show. So what do you got for us, Zane?
Yeah, so here I am over on Google Plus. If you guys aren't familiar with Google Plus, I strongly recommend that you do. You can follow me over on Google Plus. I talk about all the stuff that I do with Colin, and more stuff like unto that. There I am on Google Plus, and here is my community on Google Plus called G-Tron Marketing, because, well, I'm a big nerd, and when you put all the components of Google together, it's like one big, giant, awesome robot of marketing. So that's where the nerdy name came from. And yeah, if you're, yeah, well, sorry?
I was going to say it's topic appropriate today because we're talking about nostalgia.
Right, yes, perfect, perfect. So yeah, when you got a minute, come and check it out. We talk about all the nerdy, awesome things of YouTube, Hangouts, Google Plus, and AdWords for video. So thanks, Colin.
No worries, man. I'm frequently surprised that colleagues who are marketing experts, much more so than me, should be up to speed and hip on internet things that don't realize that you can do what it is that we do with this show, which is record it live via Google Hangouts and have people jump in and chat with us and interact with us. And then it streams directly to YouTube so other people can watch. And then it's saved to YouTube. So, like, I don't even need anything but this webcam to do a live weekly show. Of course, with Zane's help, because Obviously, if I was running things, you saw how late I was. So, as always, much appreciated, Zane. And you guys should go check out what he's got going on to thank him for his contributions. Um, as I mentioned, this week's show topic is about nostalgia, which, if you think about it in a way, nostalgia is this weird kind of hallucination we have, right? Everybody knows what nostalgia is. It's like this, uh, I guess, this sort of positive viewpoint of looking at the past and wanting to, I guess, reacquire or revisit positive experiences and feelings and things from the past, you know? Um, and I say it's a hallucination because everybody's memory is kind of flawed because of various psychological biases, which we'll talk a little more about as we get deeper into the show. But basically, you remember the past as being better than it actually was, which is why you're nostalgic for it in the first place. It's really hard to compare the past fairly to the present because you have the problem of all the knowledge and skill and experience between then and now coloring your perceptions as you look backwards to where things used to be. Um, it used to be in, you know, ancient times or whatever, like nostalgia is a very old concept. Um, it used to be you just sort of think, oh man, things were awesome when I was younger, or, you know, back in the day. Things were just way better than they are now. It is just terrible now, and they were great back then. And then, you know, you would turn to your old man in front of the Cracker Barrel shop and play checkers or whatever it is old people used to do when they would get involved with nostalgia. But now, in our super saturated media environment that we live in the 21st century here, nostalgia is frequently used to sell us things over and over again. And the cycle of nostalgia is much shorter. Like, people are already talking about the best movie of the year, and like the year is just barely half over. You know, like the cycle with which things can be tickled for nostalgia and how cool things were is getting shorter and shorter. Um, really, kind of incredible. I remember when I was a kid, and I'm not like that old, you guys. Like you would go to the video store to rent the VHS tapes to watch a movie.
Right, yeah.
And the thing was, like, the movie would come out in the cinema, and I remember it being like long time before that movie would come out on VHS, like a year sometimes or more. Long time. Now, like, it's literally months away. Like, if a movie comes out in the summer and you can't buy the DVD by Christmas time, they fucked up. Like, they screwed up somehow if it's not ready that fast. Because they want to tap into that, like, excitement, right? It's they want the benefit of that feeling of nostalgia, but like, hey, you remember that movie you saw in the theater and liked a whole lot like 3 months ago? Boom. In fact, I'm surprised they don't have a way where when you buy your movie ticket, you can't immediately like pre-order the DVD and have it shipped directly to you.
Oh, that's good.
You do that shit, Hollywood. You need to send me a check. That's my idea. You all heard it.
Yeah,
Um,
patent pending.
right. So the basically the media saturates. It's not like there's some malevolent force behind them. Well, I mean, there probably is a malevolent force behind all media, but what I mean is they're not like planning to use nostalgia against you in a way. It's actually a natural evolution of particularly social involvement in media, because the feedback cycle is a lot shorter for the people who produce this kind of content that is sold to us using nostalgia, right? So they can get feedback from their audiences a lot faster, which allows them to deliver the product that the audience actually wants a whole lot faster, and it's a give and take. So it's not really the kind of thing where, you know, the puppet master is tugging on the strings to you know, get people to buy a bunch of stuff because they're greedy. It's like what would you call it? Like an ecosystem of a kind, right? Because people love nostalgia. It makes them feel good because it's basically you enjoy the quality of your own memories. So in a way, anything you're nostalgic for is not just for that thing, but you're nostalgic for yourself, your younger self, who went through that kind of thing. It's weird, but like I said, what you're remembering is not actually the past. It's a distorted version of the past viewed through your current experiences, and all the negative bits that happen are totally filed off because who wants to take up all this space in your brain remembering negative crap that happened to you? Although some people do. Like for some people, I presume it backfires. People who have very tortured, hideous pasts, they're probably not nostalgic for that. You know, they probably don't enjoy wistful memories of times long ago. That happens. But for most people, I would say 85 to 90% of people have some degree of feeling that things right now are not as good as they used to be, and they have fonder memories of the past, perhaps than like current awesome memories and experiences that they're having in the present. You know, in any quiet time to themselves, people start reconsidering the past and getting wistful for maybe opportunities missed or chances not taken based in context of things that happened a long time ago. Now, part of the reason I think nostalgia works so well is I think we've talked about this before in the show, and if we haven't, we should do an episode on it. People's brains do this thing called chunking, which is when something's new and a unique experience to you because it's the first time it's happening to you, your attention kicks into overdrive. You record a lot more information about what's happening because it's all new. But then the next time you have that same experience, it's not quite as new. It's not as novel. It's not as interesting. So it sort of gets lumped together. And the more routine things become, the less we actually pay attention to what's happening. And we shift to autopilot mode and start daydreaming or thinking about other things. An example of this would be like sometimes I'm sure you, like if you drive to work every day, I'm sure sometimes you end up at work and don't even remember being in your car. Like you know you got in your car and you drove there, but you don't remember how many lights you stopped at. You don't remember any of the cars that were around you. It just was totally routine. Nothing caught your attention. Nothing was special about it. You just zone out, basically. And that's what chunking is. Now, as you get older, more and more of everything starts to be the same, and more starts to get chunked. And if you remember, I think it was the episode where we talked about attention and how you're looking for patterns, and only things that break the pattern are interesting, and things that don't break the pattern, things that are part of the pattern, are largely ignored, and you don't even really make a strong memory about it. So the trick with nostalgia is time seems to move faster and faster as you get older because more and more of everything you do is getting chunked because it's just like everything you've already done. Right? Especially if you don't like seek out new experiences and try and slow things down, time just whizzes by you. All of a sudden, you know, you're like summer went by really fast and you're like late teens, and then you're like 30 and you're like, where did the last 10 years go? And then you're approaching 40 and you're like, I don't remember being 30 very well. Like I was 30 for 10 years, like in my 30s, and that, man, you know, it just seems to whiz by. That's why it's that chunking effect. But because of that, the past that you remember seems vast. And like the younger you get, it seems like the more and more memories you have of that period, right? Like it's because of the way your brain records memories. So when you're talking about nostalgia, there's this vast universe of things you remember about the past versus your perception of what's happening in the present is very, very small, right? And the longer you live, the bigger that backlog of memories gets. And that's how come nostalgia can be such a powerfully influencing factor, because it's grown like from the time you were little, and then it keeps narrowing and narrowing as you get older and older. Another side effect of that is because as you age, you get more responsibilities and you learn more about the world, how the world works. A lot more things come into play. Things get more hectic, more complicated, more sophisticated. Things were not like that when you were younger. For you, they're like that for grown-up adult people who are having responsibilities and difficult things to deal with. But for you, when you were younger, they like adults were taking care of that for you, right? So no matter what, it always seems like a simpler, happier, less complicated time in the past because it was because you didn't have as many responsibilities as you do now, right? Like you think about, oh man, it was awesome when I was in my 20s. Like it was awesome because you had a safety net. If your parents were still taking care of you, you were in college or whatever. You didn't have to be like buying a house or providing for a family or anything yet, maybe at that age. So of course, things seem simpler back then. Or like when people get nostalgic for the era they grew up in, just in general, things were different. It was so much better. We liked our neighbors more. We were friendlier, or whatever the case is. The reason those times seem simpler is because you had a simpler outlook when you were recording those memories. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure people who were as old as I am now in the early 80s when I grew up were pretty stressed out about Cold War shit. Like, seriously stressed out about it. And for me, in my perspective, it's like Russia is Ivan Drago there for Rocky to beat up. Like, that is the extent of the fear that I had of like a nuclear apocalypse happening because of the Cold War between the United States and Russia. It wasn't real to me. I was too little to understand it. So when I think back to the early 80s, I'm like, man, it was pretty sweet. But it's because I don't have very sophisticated knowledge and experience of the terrible things that were going on in the grown-up world at that time. Um, then the last thing that makes nostalgia really powerful and influential to us is hindsight bias, which that's sort of what I was talking about where, and I hope I'm not explaining it wrong because I read a stupid list of like 60 cognitive biases recently and they're all smashed up in my head right now. Hindsight bias is when you look back on the past and cherry pick the things that fit your current outlook so that it seems like a story leading from then to now, even though it's not necessarily that way. It's just our current outlook affects our hindsight, the way we look back on things and cherry pick memories, and we keep the things that fit with our current mentality. Like people are going to conveniently forget anything that they do that, say, maybe contradicts the person that they are now. They're going to not necessarily forget it, but they won't remember it often like they're not going to be thinking about it. So eventually it's like going to not end up as part of the story of themselves that they carry around in their head. Those little details get filed off. And that basically happens every time you remember something. You like re-edit and repolish the memory a little bit more to fit who you are now. So that's why like having a toddler is really fascinating to me because I'll have memories from when I was a toddler. He's only 2.5, so not that young, but I feel like I remember being like 3 or 4. Like I remember that age because I think I started school when I was almost 5. So like I remember before school. I remember kindergarten and things like that. I remember nursery school, the school I was in before I went to kindergarten. Not like in super detail, but like I see how young my son is, and he's like not like he doesn't have a huge vocabulary. He's like a little toddler. Well, like my memories from that time are me now in those situations. You know what I mean? I can't break my brain in such a way where I remember it from a toddler's mindset because my brain can't work that way. I can't turn off all the experiences I've had since then. So like at most my perspective memory might be off. So like my memory of the house that I went to nursery school in is all from like a 2.5 foot high point of view. You know what I mean? Like in my mind, that house had like vast high ceilings, and they may not really have been that high. It might just be that I was 2.5 feet tall, and it felt tall to me relative to the house that I lived in and grew up. And besides that, since I've never been back in that house since I was like 3 or 4 years old, like my memory has never been updated. So like a lot of times people would be like, oh, my hometown, I went back and visited and it seems so small compared to how it used to be. That's because you were literally smaller when you were there last time. So it was physically relatively much bigger to you if you lived there when you were small and you didn't come back till you were grown up. I had that same thing happen to me with the house I grew up in, which was so small, like someone bought it and they moved it. Like they put it on a truck and moved it because it was that small. You can do that to these old Cajun houses. But like the it was in my grandparents' side yard where the house was when I grew up in it. And now the house is gone. That yard doesn't seem big enough to contain my memories of the house and the yard that I grew up in. Like I used to mow that lawn when I was like a teenager, and even then it seemed huge. I look at it now and it's tiny. I used to complain about, oh, I got to cut that gigantic lawn. It's not even that big. Like it doesn't even look like even with the house not on it anymore, it seems tiny. But again, that's that weird thing of perspective. So anyway, the point of this whole introduction is to talk about the ways your perception of the past are distorted, because nostalgia is being thinking positively and wanting to reclaim things from the past that are better than anything that actually was in your past. You know, like that's why a lot of times things that we do out of a sense of nostalgia are sometimes disappointing, because the memory we have of it is far better than it ever was in the first place. It's not that things get worse, it's that we can't return to that state of innocence when we re-experience it, right? So, all that said, the next thing we're going to talk about are different phases that people sort of go through and are nostalgic for, and we're going to talk about ways that marketing sort of interferes with and taps into those things, and then just sort of, I guess, the way people behave when nostalgic for those different phases without marketing necessarily being a part of it. I guess what I'm trying to explain is people go through these states of nostalgia about these different phases of their own life with or without being manipulated into buying things. And we'll talk about the way companies and businesses try to wedge their products into natural human psychological loops that we get stuck in thinking about our own past. Before we do, it seems we're like just a little bit ahead of where the middle of the show would be, which is where I would put an advertising spot, which I happen to have something to talk about this week. So I mentioned that it's the 26th, and my son was born on the 20th, but I wanted him to be born on the 13th because he was due on the 1st, and I figured, hey, that's plenty of time. It's 2 weeks. You could come out, please. Anyways, I want him to be born on the 13th because, hey, that's cool. Like, I do a lot of cult articles that are like 13 points. You know, it would have just been a neat thing. Plus, it was Friday the 13th. Plus, it was a full moon, which those two things happening at the same time won't happen again until like 2049 or something. So it would have just been a cool story. And I'd had this idea for something I wanted to do as a promotion. And boy, it would have just tied all nicely together if the kid would have been born on the 13th. But he took another week. I still wanted to do the promo anyway. And the promo was currently the Cult of Copy, the group that I mentioned. I publish a weekly-ish newsletter for the past few months since my wife's been super pregnant. I've been averaging like 2 issues a month, but I would like to get it back to weekly. It just depends on how much I write, but I don't want to sell it too hard on the weekly thing. It's weekly-ish, more than 1 issue a month. What's in that newsletter is a collection of links of old conversations from the Cult of Copy that are maybe really popular threads that are just old, or maybe hidden gems that people might have missed because there's so much content being posted to the group. And those are edited by our assistant editor, Nick Garcia, who is a young, up-and-coming copywriter himself, which is why I trust him to pick the links that people would be interested in versus me picking them. So we put that out for people who love the cult, but maybe are not Facebook nerds like me and don't like log in multiple times a day, every day, to make sure they're not missing anything. And that proved to be very popular. Over time, I raised the subscription price to that. I also write a unique article for each issue, and those have gotten longer and longer, which is part of why it's not weekly-ish. I started out writing 1,000 words, Sometimes I think the longest one I ever did was like 30,000 words. It's ridiculous. It's obscene how long these things are getting. But I'm trying to whittle it down so I can publish regularly. Regardless, I was charging $20 a month, which is what the subscription I've gotten up to. Because of the whole 13 thing and because of the popularity of this show, I wanted to give people an opportunity to get more involved in the cult of copy for a lower price because our membership is going to double again before the end of the year. That said, I lowered the price to 13 bucks instead of 20. So you save $7 a month, 84 bucks a year if you add it all together, I think. No, is that right? Yeah, 77. Yeah, it should be like 84 bucks. I'm an artist, not a mather. Um, so it's a significant savings if you want to come in and check out the newsletter. You can do that at colinterio.com/cult newsletter. And I know Zane likes to make slides and things. You don't have to put it up now, but we'll say it again at the end of the show. I'll give the same promotion. So it's
What was
13 bucks
that?
a month. What's that?
Colinterio.com
Yeah,
/
colinterio.com/cult newsletter. Obviously, the links point to the private Facebook group if you want to read those posts. So you have to become a member, but it's free. You just ask, and I approve most people and let them come into the group. So for now, it's the cheapest it's been since I think the beginning of the year. You can get
yeah, there it is.
there it is.
$84 a year in savings. That's
Yeah,
what it was.
you can
That's
get
the number.
you can get a subscription for 13 bucks a month. The current issue out right now is about using logical using logical fallacies to not only win arguments but sell things to people, kind of similar to what we're talking about today. Doesn't strictly tie in, but hey, check it out. It's a big long article, and you can get that for 13 bucks a month if you go to colinterio.com/cult newsletter, or if you're a member of the group, it's the post with the big scary crow image in it. There it is. So that is our sponsor for our free show this week. Myself sponsored my own show.
Nicely done.
If you're interested in an ad spot like this, I do them in the middle of the show or at the end of the show. Like I said, we're going to be a podcast, and we do the show weekly here on YouTube. If you're interested in getting one of those ad spots, get in touch with me. They're not available yet, but they will be soon. And I have a little list of people who are already looking forward to having those ad spots. If that's you, get in touch. Moving on, back to the content of the show. So the first phase we're going to talk about, where marketing kind of manipulates us and hooks into our sense of nostalgia, is childhood. Obviously, we talked a good bit about childhood. The trick with childhood is it's not necessarily easy to get a grown-up to buy things based on nostalgia from his childhood. There are very few things, like treats is sometimes something where you can get a grown-up to go after a childhood indulgence, ice cream, popsicles, that kind of thing. I've seen that done before where it's like, get a bomb pop as a grown-up. Remember how cool it was when you were a kid, that kind of thing. But like the stuff that kids have is not actually stuff grown-ups want, generally speaking. So it's not like I get nostalgia for Voltron or He-Man or whatever. I'm not going to buy toys. Some grown-ups do. They make grown-up versions of toys. They call them like collectibles or whatever. So for super nerdy people, you can buy like, ooh, it's a really sophisticated statue of like Snake Eyes from G.I. Joe. For grown-ups, not for kids, but it's a toy. Let's be honest.
Right. I've seen.
Go ahead.
No, I've been seeing cereal commercials, right? That are like, oh, it's okay. Like, you can be a grown up but still eat all your favorite childhood cereals. It's okay.
Right. The business executive eating his like Cinnamon Toast Crunch or whatever. I get it. The way you tap into nostalgia to get grown-ups to buy products, you can do it a few ways. You can change the medium. So like Transformers is like a very successful movie franchise in the 2000s and 2010s, I think. Did they all come out in 2010 and above? I'm not sure.
Around
Anyway,
there, yeah.
in the early 80s, it was a kids' cartoon show, like so. See? Ta-da!
Nice.
By the way, a kid at my kid's school noticed this shirt today and said, he has a Transformer shirt. He has more than one Transformer shirt. And I realized I wore my Decepticon shirt earlier in the week. So, as a grown-ass man, I have 2 t-shirts in my wardrobe that are reminiscent of a cartoon that I was a fan of when I was a kid and had lots of toys for. My current kid's too little, so I haven't bought him any Transformers yet, but he's going to get some Legos. That's going to happen. Um, so changing the medium has proven very successful because those movies are like billion-dollar movies or whatever, at least the whole franchise as a whole is. They even got the same guy to do the voice of Optimus Prime from the cartoon show from when I was a kid. The idea being dads that are my age are either going to bring their kids, or single dudes that are my age are just going to go see it because it's it's an action movie. Like, single dudes at my age are just big giant grown up kids. I am too, even though I have kids. But by changing the medium, they made it into a product that is more appropriate for people my age to indulge in that nostalgia, right? Like, I'm not going to go buy new action figure toys, but I'll go see a movie based on a franchise that was popular when I was a kid. They've done it with G.I. Joe. They haven't done it with He-Man. I don't think He-Man's going to translate very well into modern
Yeah,
aesthetics.
not so much.
It's one of those things where you look back on and you're like, man, I didn't realize how homoerotic that was.
But you'd be surprised they made a movie about Battleship.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know?
So Hollywood is officially out of ideas. But what else they do? I used to watch a lot of Thundercats, which they didn't make a movie of, but they did try to like resurrect. Like, Cartoon Network spent a bunch of money trying to make a new modern cartoon out of it. And what was interesting, I don't think it succeeded. Like, I think they did 1 season and it got canceled. But the resurrection of it, I didn't watch it, but my understanding is that it was not like a kid's cartoon. They like upped the sophistication level to make it for like grown-ups that like cartoons, which I thought was an interesting stylistic choice. Um, so that's one way that people can tap into nostalgia, using someone's childhood to get them to buy things. You'll notice, and again, I'm just a big grown-up kid, so I don't necessarily do it strictly for marketing nostalgia purposes, but in my own work, I reference a lot of things like video games from when I was a kid, toys from when I was a kid, cartoons. I've referenced like Voltron and Zelda and Mario Brothers and like the old versions of these things that people my age would recognize and feel a connection to. I'm doing that specifically to show you that we have the same nostalgia. Like, I'm trying to create a connection because we like the same things. We have common experiences in our past that brings us close together. So I'm not using it to directly sell you anything, but I am using it to make you think we are friends, which we should be, because we would be friends in real life if you're watching the show. But it feels to you like it's a two-way communication because you're like, I like Zelda too, but I can't hear you. I'm just talking to space. And you make the connection because I'm putting it out there, but we're not actually having a connection. That's the wonderful illusion of mass media, is that you're looking at your screen and you see me. I don't see you. I see Zane. I'm talking to Zane
Like,
the whole time during the show. But I bet to everybody out there, it feels like we're talking, right?
yeah, like
So that's part
Pepperidge
of the
Farms.
reason. And what's that?
Right? Like, well, like the commercial itself, Pepperidge Farms. Like, do you remember this? Pepperidge Farm remembers.
Oh yeah,
Right?
those guys. They tap into that's a special kind of nostalgia we're going to talk to before we get to the end of the show. We're going to talk about. But that one is particularly interesting because it's like getting people to be nostalgia for a time they actually have no real experience of because it's before they were alive. That's like some super nostalgia game. So let's see. Toys into movies. We talked about how it can be generational, where you can use nostalgia to get people to buy things for their own kids, which is why you see styles and fads that kids are into are cyclical. I don't think that is because that's what kids want. It's not that kids all of a sudden think things their parents played with are cool. It's that the companies that sell toys know that the parents can be like, "Oh, that was cool when I was a kid. I'm going to buy it for my kid." And the kid's like, "Well, this is pretty cool, I guess." So it creates this generational interest that makes fads seem to come and go. But that's not really because the kids are tastemakers who happen to be nostalgic. It's because nostalgic companies tap into their parents' wallets to get the parents to buy things for the kids, and then the kids adopt it as their own, and it goes on and on and on. Um, let's see. We talked about hindsight bias in general. Um, to talk specifically, I was a huge He-Man fan. We mentioned that before. My wife bought me like a DVD of like some episodes, like, hey, it's a little, gift or whatever. I watched it. It's awful. It's god awful. It's so bad. Like I can't I can enjoy it on a whole other level now because it's so bad it's good. Like it's one of those things where like it was so many cartoons that came later did a better job, but they were basically glorified toy commercials. They were produced by the toy companies. And the reason, I don't know if a lot of people know this, cartoons from the 80s had their little like, the more you know, like moment at the end where they had to teach a lesson. The reason they had to do that is because otherwise the FCC was going to make them label those cartoons as commercials. So they had to put educational content in it because otherwise it is
Oh
like
wow.
straight up a long form toy commercial. So in order for them to call it a show, the FCC made them put educational lessons. So that's why they had the little moment at the end of all these 80s cartoons that were there to teach you something, because otherwise they were just flat out toy commercials. And it's kind of obnoxious when you think about it. But the reason I brought that part up is because, like, if you watch He-Man now, you're like, they didn't even try to do, it's like they're like, draw a bunch of pictures of the toys. Just make them say whatever. I don't care. like there's barely any plot cohesion or anything, but it was my favorite cartoon when I was a kid. So hindsight bias really skews it. Like if I had never watched it again as an adult, in my mind I would still think it was like a good show, because like I said, I've never amended my experience with it. In my mind, my like 4 or 5 year old mind, it was amazing, but I have no modern experience of it. So in my mind, it remained amazing until I actually saw it and brought all of my adult experience and knowledge and taste to bear on that particular show. And then also we talked about how things seem simpler and safer when we're nostalgic about that time in the past. And because we were children then and didn't have those adult responsibilities, the world at large seemed like a safer place at that time to us, even though it wasn't. It's just because we were a kid back then. You can use those memories to trick people into thinking the present is suckier than the past. And you see that a lot in politics, where they'll say, like, well, when I was growing up, things were so much better and nicer, and everybody in the audience is like, yeah, it was. Well, it's like, because other people were in charge and you didn't have to do shit. Of course it was easier and more fun and nice. Like, you can't think objectively about the way the world was when you were younger without very specific effort, because you're always going to remember it from the point of view of the age you were at that time. And the stupid version to think of it is like music. Everybody thinks music from when they were a teenager and really into music was better. But it's not. It's just you listen to a lot more music at that age because you didn't have shit to do. Like,
Yeah.
I remember sitting in my bedroom just listening to music. Who does that as a grown-up? I'm just going to sit in a room by myself and listen to music. I got other stuff to do. I didn't when I was a teenager. I couldn't drive. I was too old to play with toys. So I'd sit there and listen to music. And what would I spend my money on? Music. So I had a ton of music. I don't even know what bands are out now, Stuff plays on the radio. I'm like, I've heard that like 4 times. I don't even know who that song is by. So that's childhood. The next phase that is frequently tapped into is young adulthood. So late teens, early 20s, when you're making the transition from being a kid that your parents take care of to being an adult responsible for yourself. And in that window, most people really do lots of stupid things, myself included. Um, things where, fortunately, I didn't get caught, but would have been very serious grown up consequences if I'd have got caught doing childish behaviors at the wrong age. So it's a weird period. It's a wild time. You're flooded with hormones. You constantly want to reproduce. There's a lot of partying going on, and then that era, the way marketing taps into that era is by tapping into that energy, right? That young, don't give a crap, YOLO, like fun, like just not caring, that whole like spring break mentality, right? Like I remember being a teenager and seeing like video footage of spring break and thinking like that looks awesome. And I see that now and I'm like that looks like a nightmare. That looks like herpes and hotness from being crowded. That looks like I see a crowd of drunk people bumping into you and I'm like that all those people's pockets are picked. That's what just happened. All those people got robbed and they're going to have regrets in the morning is what's happening right there. But that's just a matter of perspective. Anyway, midlife, the concept of a midlife crisis is when you have that natural urge to return to that. And a lot of times it has to do, the reason it happens in midlife is because for most people that got started building a family and having a responsibility young and maybe skipped over that phase, midlife is when it stabilizes enough to where you have the time to entertain the possibility of revisiting that period in your life. You're nostalgic for it. So a lot of times people will buy like cars meant for younger people or try to get into younger people's music, or some jerks crash their whole family trying to reclaim a youth that's been lost forever. You can never really get it back, but there's that natural tripwire, and I think that is when it happens, is when a middle-aged person gets stable enough to where it would be possible to live with the abandon of youth, but you have your own safety net now, right? Like, it seems dumb when you're a little bit older and you're building your life to entertain the possibility of that. But now when you're older and stable enough, because you're like old enough to be the parent, you have your own safety net. And I think that's when it starts to become like when people are like, I don't know what that guy's thinking. He's like 50 years old and all of a sudden he's acting like a 20-year-old asshole again. That's why, is because he's like, I'm old enough to have my own safety net. Like, I'm my own dad. Like if I get into trouble, I can get myself out of it. So it's the one time where wanting to act crazy can resolve with, I can actually handle the consequences of that because I'm old enough. Um, Marketing obviously taps into that a lot. Supplements tap into that. Weight loss products, cars. Uh, I think even like television shows to some degree. Like I think something like Mad Men seems particularly designed to have an appeal to older people, even though it's for an era like in the 50s. I don't think anybody watching the show was like a grown up in the 50s to be like, yeah, that's how it used to be for me. It's mostly tapping into that nostalgia where people don't have the experience of living there, so it seems new and magical to them. But that's one show that's meant to appeal of people of that age. Like the character of Don Draper is an older guy. I don't see anybody 20 watching that show being like, man, I really relate to Don Draper and his like midlife alcoholism. You know what I mean? Like, he's not a hero to those people, but he's a character that the audience that relates to him is an older audience, and it's meant to tap into that nostalgia because the arc of the show is him aging and sort of coming full circle. At least that's what it's looking like in the last season.
Do you think that like it's also people remembering what their parents and grandparents talked about? Like they're
Oh,
they're borrowing
absolutely,
nostalgia?
absolutely. It's one of those things where the timing of it is very tightly matched to tap into that generational nostalgia in that backwards way. So, like another show that did that was The Wonder Years, which was a really popular show when I was a kid. I liked it because I liked the kid characters, but grown-ups who had kids liked it because it was
Mhm.
set in the era when they were growing up. And the
Yeah.
same thing was sort of the deal with Freaks and Geeks was another good show where like I was too old to relate directly to the kid characters on that show who were very young. But the show was set in the early 80s, which is when I was that age. So like it was a double loop kind of where like the
Yeah.
parents could be nostalgic and the kids could look at it from a modern context and it looped back on itself.
Yeah.
Um,
That '70s show is another
yeah,
one.
yeah, that '70s show is probably like the purest iteration of that concept to be like, we're going to create a kids show set in an earlier era to have that nostalgia. They just did it so blatantly, they just flat out called it that '70s show.
Yeah.
Whereas like Happy Days, like think about how dictatorial that title is. You know, like the show is
Yeah.
literally manufactured to tap in to nostalgia. But what's hilarious is that vision of the past that a show like Happy Days created that never existed. That whole like '50s bebopping in the cafe with the cool guy with his greaser haircut and his cool like that didn't really exist. Yeah, like that's portrayed as if like this is what it was like in the '50s in America when like it was not really. Like maybe one or two places in California were like that with the whole like car culture and greasers and cheeseburgers and poodle skirts and all that stuff. But like that was not like universal experience of life in the 1950s in America.
No, it was not.
No, no. Um, so that's young adulthood, and then you have what we talked about: nostalgia for a bygone era, a time long past, a time and place you never actually lived. Um, I asked somebody once what it's called when you're nostalgic for things that come from a time that you never even lived, and somebody said it was called taste. I thought that was pretty awesome. Um, but this desire for the simplicity of a bygone era. First of all, looking at how this happens, where people have this divorced idea of like the wonderful time and place it was in the past relative to now, I think has that. It's because of the compounding effect of generations over time. So like I'm going to be super nostalgic about how idyllic the early 80s were when I grew up, right? And like my young adult period is like the mid to late 90s into the early 2000s. Um, the terrible circumstance of 9/11 is definitely like a big like gap, like a big slash mark through the timeline of my emotional development, I guess you would call it. Like that definitely is one of these things that like changed the world the same way a generation before Kennedy being assassinated. Like everyone talks about, oh, I remember where I was on that day. Well, people in my generation talk about remembering 9/11 in the same way. It's but what happens is with that nostalgia, I'm going to remember it a certain way, and if I explain it to my kids a certain way, then maybe they explain it to their kids a certain way. Now all of a sudden it's this polished, super positive version of the era that it's not actually what it was at the time. And you can see really interesting effects in this regard for things that go on for a very, very long time. So, like, the history of a particular country is one. So, like, patriotism is one of these things that is very venerating and very uh, they praise the past a lot, the sense of patriotism, like, oh, the founding fathers, they were great men, visionaries, but they're also like slave owners. You know what I mean? So they're like, it's the land of the free. If you're like a white dude who owns land, because it's not free if you're a woman or if you're black or if you're a native. Like, land of the free for us, dudes like us. That's free. It's totally free. Otherwise, not. Like, that part gets kind of glossed over because we just file the edges off of it as it gets retold over and over throughout history, right? Like, this idea that the U.S. only goes to war when we're the good guys and we got to like step in and stop the bad guys of the world. Whereas if you actually look at a timeline of American history, we've pretty much been at war constantly, like since we started with a war, and then we just kept having them. Every once in a while, we have a little dip, and then we're like, man, I'm bored. Let's start another war with somebody. Let's go have a police action somewhere, you know? And like, that's not the way it's taught to you in school, so that's not the way you think about it, but try that sometime. Look up all the wars the U.S. has been in, and then like a timeline of the entire history of the country. Like, we pretty much, like, we're a warlike culture, basically, if you look at it from that point of view. And again, like, looking up at these historical figures as like, oh man, those guys must have been like super smart and brave and cultured, and you know, like, you look at Thomas Jefferson, and he said, man, that dude said some smart stuff, and he wrote a lot of stuff, but also he like boned his slaves, and they had his children, and then he let those children be raised as slaves. You know, like, that's pretty jacked up. But he didn't write about that. So when you quote him, you don't get to quote him saying jacked up stuff about the jacked up stuff he did in real life. You just get to quote the cool things he wrote down, and he only wrote down the cool things that he had to say. So because of that, and I don't mean to just, like, the whole world is like this. It's not just America. I don't mean to be picking on my own country here, but it's just something that you see a lot of where it gets filed off. Religion is another thing that has been passed on and repeated and indoctrinates people when they're kids, to where all like the really negative, destructive stuff gets filed off, and the story gets changed, and people don't even have the original facts straight. Like, you still meet people, I still meet people and talk to them that think like the 4 Gospels were written by the actual disciples, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Is that right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? I think. I don't know. I'm not a biblical scholar. Right. So anyway, there are people who think the Gospels were written by those dudes, being the same dudes that knew Jesus. But it wasn't. They were written by monks who took those names decades after Christ was dead. I guess people just jump to that conclusion, but like, those sort of things get polished and filed off, and now people have this like very skewed vision of the evolution of, say, something like Christianity. Like, it leaves out all the bloody land wars and crusades and things, and inquisitions and all of that stuff, Salem witch trials. They don't really tell those in the context as part of that timeline. They're just things that happened. But they're not. They're actually part of that whole unfolding history. So the point of that is, this is how people can have nostalgia for a bygone era. And we made that joke just a minute ago about how, like, things were not like happy days in the 50s in the United States. It was actually a terrible time of great upheaval, like with the civil rights movement, and it was on the cusp of like the hippie movement, which is when teenagers were just like, man, screw all y'all adults. We're just like not participating in society. And like, that was like the Cold War tensions with Russia building up. We're like post World War II. There's economic problems. Anyone who's like, man, the 50s, things, we really had it together in the 50s. Like, I can tell you're not a black person, because they had a really hard time in the 50s. Like, they had to fight really hard to just get like basic rights that everyone takes for granted today. But because of this process, these earlier eras that people didn't live in get this like gloss, and you can't even look at them clearly until they get far enough away. Then they become history instead of like just a time your dad was alive. You know what I mean? Like, there has to be enough time in between for it to become history, and then people can start looking at it objectively and say, you know, man, it was really crappy back then, but everybody just kind of thought it was okay because, I don't know. What was wrong with people? We don't know. You know, it seems bizarre to us that like that was a time where like it was perfectly okay to just buy a person and make them do all your work. Like that was just like you could just do that. Like you could go to the city and pay a few $100 and buy a living human being that you owned, and then you could take them home and say, "Do all this stuff, or else I'm gonna hit you." You know, like that. That seems insane, but you got to think like at one time, think of like your little old grandma. At one time, somebody's little old grandma, for you to tell them that's not okay, they'd have been like, "What are you talking about? Everyone has slaves. It's like you're just supposed to have slaves. It's not even a big deal." But we can't even conceive of that now. So like we cut that part out of it when we look at history and we think, oh, you know, it's like beautiful, beautiful era. It was so much better back then. It was so simple and everybody had freedom on their mind and so noble.
Right.
Mm.
Louis C.K. points out that you can do amazing things as long as you have unlimited human suffering.
Right, right. Like slavery is the worst thing that ever happened, but maybe it's responsible for every gigantic human achievement ever made. Like from the iPhone to the Great Wall to the pyramids. There's nothing you can't do if you can throw unlimited human suffering at it. That's a good bit. I think that's in his Oh My God special, which
Yeah.
is it's the one he did in the round. I think it's on Netflix now if anybody wants to check that out.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the same concept. So people have trouble looking at especially the past that they want to claim as being in step with their current worldview. So like currently in American politics, the whole conservative movement is the one that really looks at like, this is what the founding fathers meant when they wrote the Constitution. I'm like, what the founding fathers meant when they wrote the Constitution was rich white dudes get everything and no one else can say anything about it because they can't even vote. You know, so like it wasn't quite the way that they portray it, where they're these like high-minded dudes who are like, oh, there's freedom for everybody. Because if it was like that, the Indians could vote. I'm sorry, that's what they call them, natives. Native's the right term. But even that, I think even that is in that Louis C.K. bit where like white people just showed up and they're like, we think we're in India, you're Indians. And they're like, we're not though, like demonstrably, we know that. And they're like, yeah, but we're still going to call you Indians. Like, it doesn't
That's
matter that
really
they're
good.
already Indians that live in a country called India, which is not here. You guys are Indians too. Sorry. Like, we're not changing it. That's what we thought. We're not going to admit that we're wrong. You're still called Indians.
And
Um,
here we are, even to this day.
right. So, last thing we're going to talk about, and we sort of weaved into it throughout the episode already, is that ways that sort of happen accidentally. Like, I don't think a movie company, I don't think the plan with, say, something like Transformers was we're going to create a toy, and then we're going to create a kid's cartoon, and then 20 years later, we're going to make a movie franchise out of that to get people to buy it again. I don't think they did that on purpose. But I think there are some companies now that have been around long enough that they actually are thinking generationally and looping it around to create multi-generational franchises on purpose. One company that I think does this very well is Nintendo, because they keep reusing those same characters over and over with every new generation of consoles. They create a flagship title for that console with their flagship characters because they're making a generational audience on purpose. They're making a touchstone so that a kid can buy a console today and have characters in that game that his dad will remember or his mom will remember. I don't mean to be sexist about it. Mommies play video games too. Um, Disney is like the granddaddy of that generational character concept
Oh
because they
yeah.
created a literal place, a physical place you can take your children to be exposed to characters that you loved when you were a kid and start the cycle all over again. Like
Yeah, they
that
yeah.
that is amazing that like they realized what a key component the physical experience is for triggering nostalgia, so they built an imaginary place in the real world that they can charge you to take your kids to be inside of a living commercial for Disney products.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I've even seen like they've even jumped into that, like you said, the video game space. Like I think they
Hmm.
saw that and went, well, we're really good at that generational,
Oh
you know,
yeah, yeah.
nostalgia, so we're gonna jump into video games too.
There like it. My kid loves Disney Junior, and I actually like letting him watch it because for the most part they're not toy commercials in between. They're commercials from more Disney shows. So at least it's not making him want to buy things from. Well, I mean, it's not like Disney doesn't sell toys, but the reason I was bringing that up, more than one show on that channel has a video game aesthetic built into it. So, like Jake and the Neverland Pirates, when they do good things on the show, pirate coins pop up into the air and they like grab them out of the air. And then at
No.
the end of the show, they put them in a
Wow.
chest and tally the coins. Like that is a video game concept. They're collecting
Yeah.
coins and then you count them up at the end of the level, aka episode. And then like
Wow.
Mickey Mouse Clubhouse had an episode where they did a road rally and it was literally like being inside of Mario Kart. You know, like the way the
Wow, that is
camera
good.
chase was done, and like I don't know if the plan is to get young kids used to interactive environments in that way. Um, in fact, in the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, there's a character named Toodles that is just a floating Mickey Mouse head shape that is some kind of weird interdimensional leprechaun type being that they can call, and he brings tools that they need to help them do the task at hand. So Toodles is literally a menu. He's an icon menu for
So the
tools.
user interface.
Yes,
Yeah.
he's user interface for their cartoon world. And that's
That's
it, like
awesome.
I'm watching it and thinking of it in this concept, and it's blowing my mind that clearly, at least I think so, they'd be dumb to be putting those things in the show if they are not part of what is meant to introduce young kids to interactive environments.
Yeah, makes
Um,
sense.
and that's the kind of thing you can do when you're a huge company like Disney and you think generationally in that way. Um, then we have the multi generational way that you can loop, which is where we talked about like as a young kid, you hear your grandpa describing his experiences in like his camaraderie with his friends in World War II, right? And then you look at movies, black and white movies about World War II that are like kind of upbeat and makes it seem like they're having fun, even down to like what is it, Hogan's Heroes? Is a comedy, like a comedy about prisoners of war. Like that seems bananas in a modern context in a post
Right.
9/11 world. But now, like we've had Saving Private Ryan and things, because the World War II got far enough away again to be history and be looked at objectively, to where it's not like we're looking at the dirty side of it now because it's gotten farther enough away. Um, but that multi generational idea of back when your grandpa was a kid, you could like get a job at the tire shop and afford to buy a house for your family and be the sole breadwinner. Like, yeah, but also like it was not that good compared to now. Like we have a lot better things going on. You can get better jobs and make more money and have nicer cars, and you don't need your wife to be at home washing dishes and washing clothes by hand all day because we've invented machines that do that kind of thing now. And yes, it's more expensive, but it's all meant to give you more time back and blah, 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 and so on. But that idea of multi generational nostalgia, where you talk about things being passed on, like, you know, the Pepperidge Farms thing is kind of in that regard, but it's the kind of thing where, like, your grandpa was a soldier and your dad was a soldier and now you can be a soldier too. You know what I mean? It's one of those things where you can tap into not only the nostalgia of an era, but put people's family history into that timeline, and that can tie into religion and patriotism and like even local pride. That is a huge one that you see advertising follow in the local market where like we've been a family owned business in this area for like 5 generations, like when people use that advertising angle, that's what they're trying to tap into, is nostalgia for the local area and being a part of that and having grown up there. And of course, it's legitimate. I'm not saying it's fake, but I'm saying, like, don't do it on accident. Do it on purpose. So, like, if you have clients in a local area that have a long history there, use that. That is to your advantage. You can definitely tap into people's feelings of growing up in that town, and there are certain places that are like well-known locations for certain things to happen, like country music is very guilty of tapping into nostalgia in that way. And it's funny, somebody did a supercut, where they take bunches of little tiny cuts of lots of different songs and put them all together to show that, like, all the hit songs of 2013 were about trucks and girls with painted on jeans and going down by the lake or river in the moonlight and or starlight to make out and drink booze of various homemade varieties. But, like, it's like 10 different songs, and they're like one thing that really struck me is, it's like, yeah, okay, well, that's kind of the whole thing about not just country music but rock music in general. It's about, like, being young and trying to get laid, basically. Like, that's all rock music's ever been about, really. But it was particularly funny because they used the phrase painted on jeans to mean the jeans were really tight. Like, that's, I guess, like a common euphemism or something. But I thought it was funny that that particular phrasing showed up in more than one song. And I'm like, is the same person writing all of these songs? And they're just like, it made me think, like, they have one of those Casio keyboards with the pre-programmed melodies in it. And they just wrote, like, one set of lyrics, and they hit the button and just, like, changed the lyrics around to fit the new song. And they're like, yep, I wrote 6 different hits.
Done.
It's like spinners. It's like content spinners for music. That is the end of the show. I know it was a little bit rambling. I feel like I didn't hit my pace good. I took a week off and lost all my mental rhythm. Plus, got a newborn. I haven't been sleeping a lot. But hopefully that held together a little well. We talked some about, to recap real quickly, we talked about what nostalgia is, how it works, why it's so powerfully influential over people. We talked about 3 different phases that it can be used in, either childhood, young adulthood, or even people who feel nostalgic for a bygone era that they never actually lived in. We talked about how marketing can saturate and utilize any of those eras. We talked about how big companies can actually last so long that they can create generational loops in mind on purpose instead of just accidentally, and you're going to see more and more of that now. And I think that's it. We wrapped it up. Nice.
Yeah. Nicely
cool.
done.
So we're going to do one more ad plug for the newsletter. If you like the show, subscribe to the show on youtube.com/cultofcopy. We're soon to be a podcast, but if you like the content and want to talk and chat and interact with people who like the same kind of topic, I got a group with like 8,000 some odd people who like to do that all day, every day. If you go to cultofcopy.com, currently that points to the Facebook group. Request to join. Unless your Facebook profile looks super spammy, I tend to let most people in and then kick the spammers out later. But join the group. We would love to have you. And then if you are a member of the group and it seems overwhelming because so much stuff gets posted, we have a paid newsletter, which I have just reduced the subscription price to, there's some spam.
Oh, really?
I saw you scroll right past it. Yep.
Oh, look at that.
You about to get kicked out.
Uh-oh. Here it comes.
As soon as I get off this show.
Yeah. Nice.
So yeah, I just reduced the price of the newsletter. The newsletter has links to lots of classic and lost gems of posts in the Cult of Copy. Also, unique article every issue from me, if you're into that kind of thing. There's a free issue in the file section of the Cult of Copy. If you join the group, you can go to the file section and get a free issue 0 there if you want to check it out. $13 a month, you get multiple issues per month, more than 1, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, but at least 2 every month. That's it. I know that was like a terrible pitch, But that's what I'm doing. That's what I'm doing. If you want to get involved in the cult of copy and you just love it and you want more and more and more of it, I suggest you join the group, read the group, participate in the group, sign up to the newsletter. Every little link that's in the newsletter, follow it, jump into those conversations too. Pop them up to the top of the page if you want to. We love when that happens. As usual, I am your host, the Reverend Dr. Sir Colin D. Terrio, Pontifex Maximus of the Cult of Copy. Weekly episodes of this show are recorded live Thursdays, 2 p.m. Eastern. Join us if you want to interact, ask questions, make fun of us, do whatever you like, or watch older episodes of the show, like we said, on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/cultofcopy. Subscribe if you dig it. Share it with your friends. When it's a podcast, you can do the same thing. Click subscribe, click like, give it all kinds of stars if you're into that kind of thing. And if you have anything you want to share with us or ask, talk about on a future episode of the show, anything like that, maybe you want to be an advertiser, just get in touch. I'm not hard to find. Once again, at cultofcopy.com. Zane, we got any questions or comments or anything from any attendees?
You know what? Just one.
Okay.
Lexus Russ or Lexus Roos says, "Hi, are you from England?"
No. All right, that concludes the questions for this week. I am going to start doing a better job, I think, of trying to get conversations about the weekly show topics going in the group ahead of time, because I would love to interact with people more on the show, because that's the whole point of doing it live. And maybe I create too much content and we go over. This was supposed to be a 1 hour show and we still went like 1 hour and 15 minutes. But, we'll work on it. You guys are cool. Thanks for coming. Catch up on this recording later if you came in late or missed it. And we'll see you next week. Same time, same place. Adios.